From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. America may not yet officially be in an economic recession, but we most certainly are in what's now being called a friendship recession. Alarming new data show that levels of loneliness and isolation have hit record levels, and the problem is particularly acute among men. That's not just a crisis for the dudes. It's a crisis for our whole society and for our politics. Today on Lever Time, why American men are experiencing this quiet crisis that's changing our culture, and how we can combat this loneliness epidemic before it gets far worse. That's coming up on today's episode of Lever Time.
Loneliness. While 1 in 2 adults say they're lonely, men often have a tougher time dealing with what the Surgeon General now calls a national epidemic.
Last year, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy sounded an alarm, but it wasn't about a disease or a pandemic. It was about a broader social problem causing all sorts of public health issues.
We've realized that loneliness is more than just a bad feeling. It has real consequences for our mental and physical health. It increases our risk of depression, anxiety, and suicide, but social disconnection also raises the risk of heart disease and dementia and premature death on levels on par with smoking daily, and even greater than the risks that we see associated with obesity.
Men in particular are struggling. A recent study found that only 26% of men reported having 6 or more close friends, down from 55% back in 1990. Roughly 15% of men say they don't have any close friends, compared with 3% in 1990. Today, American men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women, and 71% of opioid overdose deaths are among men. So in the larger friendship recession now plaguing America, the dudes are not doing okay. And whether or not you're a man, that should concern you, because it's changing our politics, our culture, and our entire society. This is not an easy topic to discuss. To be honest, it's a topic that's been frowned upon, especially among some liberals of late, who seem to scoff at the idea that we should care much about the problems particularly plaguing men, because men have been the more privileged of the genders. In recent years, some liberals have turned maleness into an explicit political weapon. The term Bernie bro became an epithet hurled by elite liberals and establishment Democrats at supporters of Bernie Sanders.
You know, look, even in the primary, some of what we saw with the Bernie bros had a real chilling effect on a lot of women.
That strategy didn't just drive male voters away from Democrats and help get Donald Trump elected and reelected. It's also made it far more difficult to even talk about the underlying problem of male loneliness that's become so widespread. And here's the thing. Whether or not you say you care about that problem, it does affect you, because male loneliness is fueling some of the destructive political trends of this era.
Men are really in a bad shape right now. After Trump was elected, everybody talked about how the manosphere elected Trump. And I've been listening to these podcasts, not just Joe Rogan, but Theo Von, the Nelk Boys, all these guys. And these are podcasts that millions and millions of men listen to, most of whom are apolitical guys.
This is Sam Graham-Felsen. He was once the chief blogger of Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, and he's a novelist and journalist whose recent New York Times Magazine piece was entitled, "Where Have All My Deep Male Friendships Gone?" As a middle-aged guy, he found himself caught in the loneliness epidemic and realized how it draws men into the so-called manosphere of YouTube shows and podcasts that subtly spread conservative ideologies.
Why are they listening to podcasts? I have a pretty good guess why they're listening to podcasts. They're not hanging out with friends.
Right.
They're actually lonely, and they're spending, hours and hours listening to podcasts, as I was doing, which I wrote about in this article, right? They're deluding themselves into thinking that listening to these podcasts is some kind of replacement for hanging out with their friends.
I read Sam's piece and was deeply moved by it. Not just because it described a political phenomenon, but also because it described something that I've personally struggled with in my own middle age. I'm blessed with having many friends, but it's become harder to maintain and cultivate those relationships, and I've been wondering why that is. I've got a few theories. For instance, in a country without a guarantee of healthcare, vacation, family leave, free college, and retirement, many of us at this age have less time to spend with friends and with our community because we're working longer and longer hours to make ends meet. There's also technology. Our computers and our phones are optimized to addict us and steal our attention away from human connection. It's the whole bowling alone phenomenon, only now it's supercharged by a dystopian economy and digital technology. But these are just my theories about the causes of the male loneliness problem, and I wanted to go a bit deeper. So I invited Sam Graham-Felsen onto Lever Time to explore what's going on at a societal level. I started by asking him this question: why do American men struggle with friendship?
I think it's one of those chicken and egg things where it's a problem because we don't talk to each other about emotional stuff in general. And that's a big part of why I think so many men struggle with friendship. I am not somebody with no friends. And it's funny because a lot
Full
of people.
disclosure, I have
Right. I think a lot of people who just saw the headline and didn't necessarily read the piece were like, oh, Sam, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were like this loser with no friends. The point of my piece was not that I have no friends. The point of my piece is that I actually have a lot of friends, but I just don't talk to them. Even my best friends, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, get on the phone and talk to them, see them in person. And honestly, even that's a stretch. It might be more like once a year. And what I tried to investigate in the piece, I didn't know why this was happening to me. I also didn't know how pervasive it was until I started reporting on the piece. I had a sense that it was happening to other guys in middle age as well. I'm 44, and I know that other friends of mine had a similar problem, but I didn't really know what was going on with me. I was like, how did I turn into this guy who every Thursday night, instead of, after I've tucked my kids into bed, I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, like I have the power to go out and meet a friend and have a beer or whatever. And I just wasn't doing it. I was sitting at home watching Netflix by myself, and going to bed. And what is that? This was just my hypothesis. And, I'm curious if it rings true for you, David. Everyone says they don't have time for friends. And that's true. Look, when you get to middle age, you're a hell of a lot busier than you were when you're in your 20s and you don't have kids. But I don't think it's really so much about the time thing as it is about just the awkwardness of hanging out when you haven't hung out for a while. And, for those of us who had kids, that was a necessary period where you're not doing a lot of hanging out because you're just so busy, you're not sleeping. But then you get out of practice. And I think, not to gender things too much, but I know that my wife finds it very easy to just sit down at a cafe, have a cup of coffee, look at one of her, girlfriends in the eye and talk in a heart-to-heart way. That is not so easy for me, and it's not so easy for a lot of guys I know. There tends to need to be like lubrication with alcohol or pot or something else to loosen things up. There needs to be a game on in the background, and it's complicated, and I think it's kind of exhausting. And as a result, a lot of men just figure, why bother?
Yeah, the inertia thing is a real thing, but I do think the metaphor of working out is the right way to think about this. That if you have to work out to keep your muscles healthy, to keep your body healthy, and if you don't do that, your muscles atrophy.
Yes.
It's the same thing for hanging out and having social experiences, that if you're not regularly committing yourself to doing it, the part of your psyche that can do it atrophies a little bit. And I think to women listening, they may wonder, why is this? And why was your piece focused on the gender-specific part of this? Like, what is it about guys, dudes, bros, whatever you want to call them? What is it about maleness that you think makes this particularly difficult?
Yeah. And look, I have to say up front that it's sort of awkward writing about this subject, especially right now when you've got a guy like Trump in power and white men are on the top, and there isn't a huge appetite for people to hear about the sorrows of heterosexual white dudes. It was more just like, hey, yeah, we may be on top of the power hierarchy in society, but like, what's going on inside of us, right? Inside of us, it kind of sucks, right? We have all of this political freedom, but we are kind of emotionally unfree in a million different ways. I'm not here to compare, whether it's harder to be a man versus a woman, but I know for a fact that like my wife and a lot of my female friends just have a hell of a lot easier time in different emotional registers. I'll speak for myself. I find it's much easier for me to either be pissed off or, joking around than it is for me to be sad, right? Like, in fact, I think it's often when something sad happens to me, my first response is like to be pissed off and swear about it or blame someone or something like that, rather than just to like absorb that a sad thing happened and, God forbid, cry. You know what I mean?
After the break, Sam and I discussed how fear of intimacy and being seen as gay has pushed men farther apart from each other. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lever Time.
There's been a big misunderstanding here.
When I was growing up, it was an era of homophobia, particularly with straight men on television. There always seemed to be some kind of gay panic joke in a TV show or a movie. The joke was always kind of the same. If guys momentarily showed any kind of affection or vulnerability with one another, it was cue the gay joke, like this one from the famous 1993 Seinfeld episode called The Outing.
We're not gay. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
I mean, it's fine if that's who you are.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have many gay friends.
My father's gay.
In most of these gay panic jokes, the dudes always needed to defiantly insist that being friends in no way interfered with their heterosexuality.
I know what I heard.
Heard. It was a joke.
All right, look, you want to have sex right now? Do you want to have sex with me right now? Let's go.
In recent years, America has become somewhat more welcoming towards gay people, which is a milestone. And heck, at the time, that Seinfeld episode was seen as kind of groundbreaking for the not that there's anything wrong with it caveat. But this fear of showing emotion, the fear of affection signaling that a man is gay, still seems to be pervasive and can push men away from showing emotion and developing intimate friendships. In his New York Times piece, Sam wrote about how men haven't always had this fear that their expressions of friendship would be perceived as homosexuality. I asked him to describe that earlier era when that wasn't the case, and then asked him to pinpoint when things started to change.
I quoted two guys who, I think of as pretty manly dudes. We've got one guy who, many consider the father of our country, Abraham Lincoln, who ended slavery. It's a pretty masculine activity.
Mm-hmm.
We've got another guy who wrote Moby Dick, which is probably the most masculine energy book in American literature about the hunt for the white whale, Herman Melville. Both of these guys wrote their best friends letters that would sound in today's lexicon like gay love letters, right? But they were just letters expressing how much they missed their friends. Talking about, Melville said that Nathaniel Hawthorne, one of his, close friends, he said, "Your heart beats in mine." That's just not the way that at least straight men talk to each other now. So what changed? I think there are two factors that I learned about while researching this article. One is that just marriage as an institution changed. So a hilarious thing that I found out researching this article is that men used to be so close to their friends that they would often invite their best man to come on their honeymoon with them. So imagine that, going to Paris and be like, "Honey, I'll meet you at the Eiffel Tower in an hour. I just got to grab a beer with my bro first on the honeymoon." But men were very close.
I mean,
to
that
their
kind of
friends.
rules, actually. But
It's pretty fun, I know. So basically, there was this concept of blood brothers, of like people being so close to their friends that they were like family. Men used to get buried with their friends, like not with their wives, but with their friends. So for most of human history, marriage as an institution was more about sort of social arrangements, a wealthy royal family marrying into another wealthy royal family, a cobbler marrying into a leather maker so that it's easier for them to, make shoes together as a family. It wasn't really about romantic love or finding your soulmate. It came later. That came really in like the 20th century, the idea that your romantic partner is supposed to be your soulmate, is supposed to be your best friend. In the past, your friends were your soulmates. Your friends were the people that you went to with your deep emotional issues. And your wife was somebody who you made a house with and raised kids with and all that, but not necessarily someone you are having these revealing, intimate exchanges with on an emotional level. And part of what's problematic about all of this is that like so many men, myself included, end up over relying on our wives for emotional support because we're too embarrassed to talk to our friends about feeling depressed or lonely or whatever. We complain about it nonstop to our wives. And then they get sick of it because they're like, you're putting all of your emotional baggage on me. You're spending so much time complaining. You don't even have time to hear what's going on in my life.
That's right.
And that creates new kind of problems. And just one other factor that is a big one too, I think, is, you talked about gay panic earlier. One of the Kinsey reports came out in 1948. I'm talking about the famous sexologist. I think he was at University of Indiana.
Yep.
He did a research project, a survey, and his survey found that like 10% of the population identified as homosexual, at least privately in this survey. And that created this gay panic because this was 1948. The idea, everyone knew that gay people existed, but like they were like, whoa, 10%, that's way higher than I thought. And all of a sudden, like men started distancing themselves from other men, right? There was this study done where a professor examined photographs of football teams from like 1900 to 2000. And in the early photographs, the men were like sitting on each other's laps, hugging each other, arms are super intimate touching. And then by the 2000s, they're like standing apart, like soldiers with their arms to their sides, not touching at all. And I think a lot of that comes from, there's a term for it that academics use called homohysteria, which is distinct from homophobia. Homohysteria is the fear of other people thinking that you might be gay. And again, it's this weird thing where it coincides with a rise in gay rights, right? When there's more gay people out there publicly, there's a greater perception that more and more men are gay. And for a lot of straight men, that creates a deeper panic of like, oh, well, now that there's so many gay people around, if I glance over at the guy in the locker room for more than a split second, they're going to think something else is going on here. So I think those are the two big factors that have contributed to specifically to male loneliness.
After the break, I ask Sam what are some ways that men can connect with their friends and build deeper, more meaningful relationships. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lever Time. One of the things that was really moving to me in Sam Graham-Felsen's New York Times piece about male loneliness was his own personal story. Despite his loneliness and isolation, he was pushing through to find what really brought him back to life. Sam argues that this loneliness that men are feeling is part of why right-wing media has been gaining traction. Sam wrote in his New York Times piece that when he was feeling lonely, he felt particularly drawn to listening to podcasts. It seemed to fill that void of friendship in a parasocial way. Sam wrote about how
after Trump was elected, everybody talked about how the manosphere elected Trump.
Yeah.
And I've been listening to these podcasts, not just Joe Rogan, but Theo Von, the Nelk Boys, all these guys. And these are podcasts that millions and millions of men listen to, most of whom are apolitical guys, by the way. The people who listen to these podcasts are not right-wing maniacs. They're mostly apolitical dudes who like to go to the gym and like gamble on sports and stuff like that. But these are people who are spending a lot of their time listening to podcasts. Why are they listening to podcasts? I have a pretty good guess why they're listening to podcasts. They're not hanging out with friends.
Right.
They're actually lonely and they're spending hours and hours listening to podcasts, as I was doing, which I wrote about in this article, right?
I asked Sam to talk about how we can solve this problem, how men can get in touch with friends, how they can come out of their caves, how they can be out in the world again and combat the loneliness.
In terms of the practical strategies, look, for people who are stuck as I was, and to some degree I still am stuck, but look, I spent a while working on this article. I did put myself out there. And in the process of doing it, it did give me the kick in the butt I needed to make more of an effort with my friendships. I discovered a podcast called Man of the Year. It's specifically dedicated to what these guys call social fitness. It's not about physical fitness. It's about, getting better at hanging out, basically. And it's funny, they kind of borrow from the language of biohacking. They say, look, you need hacks to get over your block, right? So here's a hack. They call it TCS, which stands for text weekly, call monthly, and see quarterly, right? And again, when I first heard that, I'm like, see quarterly? Like, that's not very much hanging out with your friends. But then when I thought about it, I'm like, well, actually, once every 3 months, it's pretty good, especially for people who have a few different friends. And I think the easiest one, of course, of those is text. I think almost all men I know are pretty good at texting, right?
Yep.
Although often the problem with just texting is that like often it's just like, hey, did you see the Nuggets game last night?
Totally.
Or, hey, are you watching right now? Holy shit, that Jokic pass was specific.
Yeah, right.
The text format is not made for what you just said about your feelings. Like, you're not going to do that over text. You need to call someone to do that or see them in person. I think having that TCS thing, if you have something like that, it can just kind of make it easier for you to say, well, I have this program. I got to follow the program. It's the same reason why things like Peloton work. It's like, well, you could bike on your own, but hey, you have the Peloton thing. You're supposed to bike 10 days this month. I guess I got to do it.
I mean, I am such an advocate of routines and deadlines. There's like a rule of thumb, right? It takes you 2 weeks to get into a routine or 2 weeks to develop a habit. And now, granted, you're talking a little bit longer term, but the first couple times you do something, it's a little bit awkward. You feel a little bit like fish out of water. But I remember a couple of years ago, I sort of forced myself to get into a bowling league. And it was Monday nights, and it was with my buddies. And I know it's so funny to think like, wow, you've discovered bowling leagues. I mean, I now have a pickleball group that every week we play pickleball. And I'll tell you, there are some times where I'm like, I don't feel up to it, or I'm too busy. But knowing that it's on the calendar means that I start scheduling around it. And then it becomes like sacred time that must be scheduled around. Everything else has to sort of go around it unless there's an emergency. So now it's like, it's not something I do special. It's part of my life.
Have you ever regretted getting off the couch and going to the bowling league? Probably
No,
not,
never.
right? It's
No,
always
never.
been fun, right?
Yeah,
and I was
always.
thinking about that. It's like, how many times have I said, my friend texts me and is like, come have a drink at the bar with me tonight. And I make all kinds of excuses for why it won't be that fun. And then every single time I do it, I'm like, oh, that was great. It's not like every hangout is a 10 out of 10, but I've never once regretted it. It's one of these things where it's like going to the gym. No workout is a bad workout. It's funny you mentioned bowling too, because, of course, there's this famous book, Bowling Alone,
Right, Bowling Alone,
which
right.
is about how the downfall of bowling leagues was like the major cause of male loneliness in this country. And yeah, it's gotten way worse, and it's gotten worse for women too. And, I got more mail from this than anything I've ever done in my entire life. I mean, I got hundreds of letters, and probably 30% came from women.
Yeah, what'd they say?
We struggle with the same exact things. We don't see our friends either. And the same studies that I cited in my piece, I cited this study that said 18% of men say that they don't even have a single close friend. And it used to be as little as like the 1990s, only 3% of men said that. So we're talking about like more than a 5-fold increase.
Yeah.
And the numbers are bad for women too. They are worse for men for all the reasons that I've explained. But yeah, I mean, look, the internet in general just like put on steroids all the problems that already existed. And, look, it's also like, that's another reason why on that Thursday night after I've tucked my kids into bed and a friend texts me and says, hey, you want to come have a drink at the bar? And I'm already in my shorts and, like my socks aren't on. I pick up my phone. I have like 5 WhatsApp messages. There's an NBA playoffs game on. And I'm like, I'm good. I'm just going to sit here, and this will be an adequate replacement for going out. I'll just sit here and text about whatever sick dunk I just saw to my friends. And you convince yourself that that's adequate, but it's not, because that feeling that I was talking about earlier, of that good kind of like glowing feeling you get after you've hung out with your friends in person, you're just never going to get that from the back and forth online.
Your piece is really important. We're going to link to it in the show notes here. It was basically a revelation that this thing that I am experiencing is not weird or strange or an oddity. It's a thing that lots and lots and lots of people are experiencing. So thank you so much for writing the piece, and thanks for taking time with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, for ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com. That's levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.